A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Have you ever considered the weight of being the last person on Earth who can only see the world through one specific window? It is a heavy thought, but it is one that goes to the heart of how languages live and die. We talk a lot about language preservation, but we often focus on the number of speakers. Today, I want to look at a different metric, the monoglot, the person who has no other linguistic fallback. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt that really got me thinking about this, specifically looking at the contrast between the decline of Irish Gaelic and the incredible, almost miraculous rise of modern Hebrew. It is a paradox, really. Is the monoglot the ultimate guardian of a language, or is their existence in the 21st century a sign of impending isolation?
It is a fascinating angle, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, this prompt really hits home for us living here in Jerusalem. We are surrounded by the success story of Hebrew every day, but we often forget that it was an engineered success. The monoglot is essentially the ultimate stake in the ground for a language. When you have monoglots, the language is a necessity. When you only have bilinguals, the language becomes a choice. And in the brutal economy of human communication, choices are often discarded for convenience. Daniel wanted us to look at the specific dates and the data here, and the contrast is stark. We are looking at the extinction of one type of monoglot in Ireland and the deliberate creation of another here in Israel.
I think we should start by defining what we mean by a monoglot in this globalized world. Usually, we think of it as a limitation, right? Someone who is stuck because they cannot speak the global lingua franca. But in linguistics, the monoglot is the anchor. They are the ones who ensure the internal logic of a language remains pure because they have no other grammar to borrow from. They do not code switch. They do not use loanwords as a crutch. They are the biological repository of a language's unique way of seeing the world.
And that is why the death of the last native monoglot is such a pivotal, tragic moment for any language. It marks the transition from a language being a primary way of life to being a cultural project. For Irish Gaelic, that moment is often tied to one specific man, say an I Nairi. He passed away in 1998 in the village of Silshomain in County Mayo. Think about that date for a second, 1998. That is well within our lifetime. Titanic was in theaters. The internet was already a thing. And yet, there was a man in Ireland who lived his entire life, caught his fish, told his stories, and dreamed his dreams entirely in a language that most of the world considers a historical curiosity.
He was a fisherman and a sandchai, a traditional storyteller. And while many people in his village spoke Irish, he was reportedly the very last person who did not speak English at all. When he died, a specific door closed on the Irish language. It went from being a primary, solitary way of life for at least one person to being a secondary language for everyone else. This distinction is vital. When Sion was alive, Irish was not a cultural project or a school requirement for him. It was simply the air he breathed. There is a profound difference between a language that exists because it has to, and a language that exists because people feel it should.
We actually touched on this cognitive difference in episode 799, where we talked about the science of first language attrition. We called it the permanent ink versus the pencil sketch. For a monoglot like Sion, the language is written in permanent ink. There is no eraser. There is no other page to turn to. When you are a bilingual speaker of an endangered language, your brain is constantly negotiating between two systems. The dominant language, in this case English, acts like a solvent, slowly dissolving the unique structures of the minority language.
I want to go deeper into what that solvent effect actually looks like. When the monoglots disappear, the grammar starts to shift. In Irish, the word order is verb, subject-object. You say, hit the boy the ball, instead of, the boy hit the ball. It is a fundamentally different way of structuring reality. But as the monoglots died out and were replaced by English-dominant bilinguals, the Irish language started to drift. People began using English syntax with Irish words. The idioms became literal translations of English phrases. The permanent ink was being overwritten by the pencil sketch of a second language.
That is a great point. Sion S. Naira represented the last of the unfiltered Irish. He possessed a vocabulary for the natural world, for the sea, and for human emotion that was not a translation of English. When he died, that specific library burned down. The Gael-talked regions in Ireland, those pockets where Irish is still the community language, are essentially bilingual now. People speak Irish to preserve their heritage, but they speak English to conduct business, to use the internet, and to talk to the rest of the world. The moment you introduce a second, more dominant language, the original language begins to serve a different psychological function. It moves from being a tool for survival to being a symbol of identity.
And symbols are much harder to maintain than tools. If a tool works, you use it. If a symbol becomes inconvenient, you might set it aside. This brings us to the engineering part of the conversation. If the death of the last Irish monoglot was the end of an era, the birth of the first Hebrew monoglots was the start of a total revolution. We know the story of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern Hebrew, but Daniel's prompt asks about the first generation of monoglots. That is where the real engineering happened. It was not enough to just have people who could speak Hebrew. They needed people who had to speak Hebrew.
It is one of the most audacious social experiments in history. Ben Yehuda famously refused to speak anything but Hebrew to his son Itamar ben Avi, who was born in 1882. Itamar is often called the first native speaker of modern Hebrew in 2 millennia. But Itamar was not exactly a monoglot in the long run. He lived in a world where he eventually learned other languages. The real shift happened in the early 20th century, specifically between 1900 and 1920. This was the era of the second and third Aliyah, the waves of Jewish immigration to the land of Israel.
I remember reading about the early kibbutzim and the schools in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem during that time. They did not just teach Hebrew, they enforced it. They had slogans like Hebrew speaker, speak Hebrew. But the goal was not just to make people bilingual. The goal was to create a generation for whom Hebrew was the only mother tongue. They were trying to manufacture the permanent ink that the Irish were losing. They were creating a linguistic vacuum that only Hebrew could fill.
There was a pivotal moment in 1913 known as the War of the Languages, or Milhemet Hasafot. It was a conflict over what language would be used for instruction at the Technion, the first technical university in Haifa. The German Jewish sponsors wanted to use German because it was the language of science and engineering at the time. They argued that Hebrew did not even have words for things like logarithm or internal combustion engine. But the local community revolted. They understood that if the highest levels of education were in German, Hebrew would always be a pencil sketch, language, a language for the home, but not for the world.
That is such a crucial distinction. By winning that war and insisting on Hebrew for physics and chemistry, they ensured that the next generation could be monoglots. They would not need German or Russian or Yiddish to understand the modern world. The first true generation of Hebrew monoglots emerged among the children of these pioneers in the 1920s. By the time you get to the Ahuzat Bayit neighborhood, which became Tel Aviv, you have children being born who were raised in an entirely Hebrew environment. Their parents might have struggled with Russian or Polish, but the children were often discouraged from even learning those languages.
It is a bit ruthless when you think about it. You are intentionally limiting a child's linguistic range to force the survival of a language. But from a nation-building perspective, it worked. By the 1930s, you had a significant population of young people who were functionally Hebrew monoglots. They were the Yelidei Ha-Ivrit, the children of the Hebrew revival. They were the absolute inverse of the Irish situation. In Ireland, English was the encroaching sea that eventually swallowed the monoglot islands. In Israel, the pioneers built a dam to keep the other languages out until the Hebrew lake was deep enough to sustain itself.
We talked about the engineering of the language itself back in episode 1037, the technical side of creating words for electricity or tomatoes, but the social engineering of the monoglot was arguably more important. Without a population that needs the language to survive, the vocabulary does not matter. So, that leads to the second part of Daniel's question. Where are we now? We live in modern Israel in 2026. It is a hyper-connected, globalized, and incredibly multilingual society. You cannot walk down a street in West Jerusalem without hearing English, French, Russian, or Arabic. So, do Hebrew monoglots even exist anymore?
That is a great question, and the data is actually quite surprising. If you look at the most recent reports from the Central Bureau of Statistics, while Israel is very multilingual, there is a very real subset of the population that is functionally monoglot. Now, we have to define our terms here. A true, absolute monoglot who has zero knowledge of another language is rare in any developed country because of global media. But functional monoglots, people who cannot conduct a complex conversation, read a book, or work in any language other than Hebrew, make up a significant portion of the core Israeli population.
I have seen some estimates suggesting that for about 5 to 8% of the adult Jewish population in Israel, Hebrew is their only functional language. This is particularly true in two very different demographics. You have the older generation of Mizrahi Jews, who may have lost their Arabic or Persian and never picked up English, and then you have a specific segment of the native-born secular and traditional population who simply never felt the need to master a second language because the Hebrew ecosystem is so complete.
And this is the ultimate sign of success for the Hebrew revival. You know a language has truly arrived when it is possible to be successful, educated, and fully culturally integrated while speaking only that language. In Ireland, you cannot really be a monoglot and participate in modern life. You are cut off. In Israel, you can be a high-level administrator, a local politician, or a business owner speaking only Hebrew. The ecosystem is self-sustaining. We have our own television, our own literature, our own legal system, and our own tech sector.
It is interesting that you mention the tech sector, because we usually think of that as being entirely English-driven. And while English is certainly the lingua franca of global tech, there are thousands of developers and engineers in Israel who speak what we might call Israeli English. They know the technical terms, but their entire conceptual world is Hebrew. If you sat them down and asked them to describe their philosophy of life or their political views in English, they would struggle. They are Hebrew monoglots in every sense that matters for their identity. They are not bilingual. In the sense of having two equal souls, they have one Hebrew soul with an English technical manual attached to it.
There's also the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox, community to consider. While many speak Yiddish, there is a growing trend among certain sectors of the Haredi world where Hebrew has become the primary and often only language. They are isolated from the English-speaking internet and global media. For them, Hebrew is not just a national language, it is the boundaries of their world. This creates a very different kind of monoglot, one protected by religious and social barriers rather than just geographic ones. It is a modern monoglot zone that is intentionally maintained.
So we have this paradox. The monoglot is a sign of a language's health, because it proves the language is a necessity. But in the 21st century, being a monoglot is also a form of isolation. Sia Nahinari was isolated by geography and the passage of time. The modern Hebrew monoglot is supported by a powerful state and a robust culture, but they are still linguistically confined compared to their bilingual neighbors. What does it do to a culture when it moves from being a collection of bilinguals to having a core of monoglots?
I think it changes the dialogue of the language. When everyone is bilingual, the language is always in dialogue with another culture. It is being translated constantly in the speaker's head. But when you have a generation of monoglots, the language starts to develop its own internal logic that is not beholden to any other system. Early modern Hebrew was often a translation of European thought patterns into Semitic roots. But the Hebrew spoken by a monoglot today in Tel Aviv is its own thing entirely. It has its own slang, its own rhythm, and its own way of conceptualizing reality that does not care how English or Russian handles the same idea.
This is what we mean when we say a language is truly alive. It has stopped being a mirror and started being a light, and that is exactly what Irish lost when it lost its monoglots. When the last person who could only think in Irish died, the language lost its independent light. It became, to some extent, a mirror of English. Most modern Irish speakers think in English and translate into Irish, even if they do it very quickly and fluently. The grammatical structures start to mimic English. The idioms become literal translations of English phrases. The unique, non-English way of seeing the world that Sion Nighty possessed is gone.
I want to push on that idea of seeing the world differently. There is a famous concept in linguistics, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that the language you speak shapes how you think. While the strong version of that has been mostly debunked, the weak version is clearly true. Different languages emphasize different things. Irish, for example, has a very different way of expressing emotions and possession than English. You do not say, I am sad. In Irish, you say sadness is upon me. It is an external force, not an internal state.
Right. And if you are a monoglot, that is the only way you can conceive of sadness. You do not have the English alternative of I am sad to compare it to. So your entire psychological relationship with your emotions is mediated through that specific linguistic structure. When you become bilingual, you gain a new perspective, but you also lose the purity of that original one. You start to see that sadness is upon me is just one way of saying it, and suddenly the linguistic magic becomes a linguistic choice.
This is why the Hebrew experiment is so relevant to other language movements. The Zionist pioneers were not just trying to save a language, they were trying to create a new type of human being. They believed that the Jewish people had been psychologically damaged by the diaspora and by speaking the languages of their neighbors. They thought that by creating Hebrew monoglots, they would create a person who was more rooted, more direct, and more connected to the land. They wanted to strip away the layers of Polish and German and Yiddish to get back to something they saw as more authentic.
And whether you agree with that ideology or not, you have to admit that the creation of the Hebrew monoglot was the key to their success. You cannot build a nation on a second language. You need people for whom the national language is their entire reality. So, let's look at the numbers again. If we say that maybe 5 to 10% of Israelis are functionally monoglot, is that enough to anchor the language? Or is the pressure of English so great that even Hebrew will eventually go the way of Irish?
I think the situation is fundamentally different because of the state. Israel provides a total linguistic environment. In Ireland, the state is bilingual, but the economy and the media are overwhelmingly English. In Israel, the state is Hebrew first. You pay your taxes in Hebrew. You go to court in Hebrew. Your children learn physics and history in Hebrew. As long as that infrastructure exists, the language is safe. The monoglots act as a sort of gravitational center. Even if most Israelis are bilingual, they are orbiting a sun that is purely Hebrew.
That is a great analogy. The monoglots are the mass that provides the gravity. They ensure that the language does not just drift away into a dialect of English. I wonder if there is a lesson here for other struggling languages. If you want to save a language like Welsh or Breton or Hawaiian, do you need to stop trying to make everyone bilingual and instead try to create a small group of monoglots?
It is a controversial strategy, but some linguists argue exactly that. They call it the nest approach. You create environments, usually preschools or isolated communities, where the second language is strictly forbidden. You are trying to manufacture that monoglot experience. The problem is that it is very hard to maintain that as the children grow up and realize that there is a whole world outside the nest that speaks a different language. It requires a level of ideological commitment that is rare. Most people today, even if they love their heritage language, are not willing to disadvantage their children by keeping them from learning English.
This is the tragedy of the modern monoglot. In the past, it was a natural state. Today, it is almost always a result of either extreme isolation or a very deliberate, almost radical choice. But I like that term you used earlier, monoglot zones. It takes the pressure off the individual to be a monoglot and puts it on the environment. It is about creating a space where the language is a necessity. If you are at the dinner table and the rule is only Irish or only Hebrew or only Spanish, then for that hour you are a monoglot. You have to find the words. You cannot cheat. That is how you build the linguistic muscle.
It is about creating a micro-ecosystem. If you look at the successful examples of language maintenance, they almost always involve these kinds of boundaries. The Amish are a great example in the United States. They maintain Pennsylvania Dutch because they have very clear social and technological boundaries that keep English at a distance. They are not absolute monoglots, but they are monoglot dominant in their private lives. They have created a world where their language is the only one that matters for their most important relationships.
It is interesting that we are seeing a bit of a resurgence in this kind of thinking. People are starting to realize that the global monoculture of English is a bit thinning. It is efficient, but it lacks depth. There is a desire to go back to something more specific, more grounded. In a way, the Hebrew revival was the first great movement of this kind, a rejection of the global for the sake of the specific. And it was successful because it was not just a hobby, it was a mission.
When I look at the history of the Yeledei HaIvrit, the children of the Hebrew revival, I am struck by how much they felt they were part of something bigger than themselves. They were the living proof that their people were back. Being a Hebrew monoglot was a badge of honor. It meant you were the first generation of free Jews in 2 millennia who were not defined by the languages of their exile. It is a powerful narrative. And it makes me think about the responsibility we have as speakers of these languages.
If you are a Hebrew speaker in Jerusalem today, you are part of a chain that was almost broken. Every time you use a Hebrew slang word instead of an English one, you are contributing to that gravitational pull we talked about. You are helping to keep the language in the realm of necessity. We should also address the misconception that Israel is a Hebrew-only environment. Daniel mentioned the rich tapestry of languages here, and he is right. We have a massive Russian-speaking population, a significant Arabic-speaking population, and English is everywhere. But the genius of the Israeli system is that all these languages are secondary to the Hebrew core.
Right, and that is the difference between a multilingual society and a society with a weak national language. A strong national language can afford to be multilingual because it knows it is not under threat. Hebrew is so dominant now that it can absorb English loanwords and host a dozen other languages without losing its identity. It has passed the tipping point. But that tipping point was only possible because of that first generation of monoglots. They were the ones who did the hard work of living entirely in a language that was still, in many ways, under construction.
I wonder what Sion Einari would have thought about the Hebrew revival. He saw his language slowly evaporating around him, while at the very same time, across the world, another ancient language was being breathed back into life. It shows that linguistic death is not inevitable. It is a choice, or rather, a series of millions of small choices made by individuals every day. Every time a parent chooses to speak their native language to their child instead of the more dominant global language, they are making a revolutionary act.
They are saying that this specific way of seeing the world matters more than convenience. They are creating a small island of monoglotti in a sea of bilingualism. So, to answer Daniel's question about the percentage of Hebrew monoglots, the data is a bit fuzzy because it depends on how you define functional monoglotti. But the fact that the number is even measurable, somewhere between 5 and 10% in a country as modern and globalized as Israel, is a testament to the success of the revival. It means that the language has successfully moved from the classroom back to the cradle.
And that is the gold standard for any language movement. Can you produce a monoglot? Can you create a person who is perfectly happy and capable, and who only needs this one language to navigate their entire life? If the answer is yes, then the language is safe. If the answer is no, then you are just managing a slow decline. It makes me appreciate our life here in Jerusalem even more. We live in a city where you can see the entire history of linguistic struggle written on the street signs.
It really is a living laboratory. For our listeners, I think the takeaway is to value the monoglots in your own life or your own heritage. If you have a grandparent who only speaks the old language, do not see that as a limitation. See it as a treasure. They are the last link to a version of the world that is not filtered through the global lens. They are the guardians of a specific kind of light. And if you are trying to learn a language, maybe the goal should not just be to become bilingual. Maybe the goal should be to find those moments where you can be a monoglot.
Go to a place where no one speaks your first language. Force yourself into that position of necessity. That is where the real learning happens. That is where the pencil sketch starts to turn into permanent ink. We have covered a lot of ground today, from the coast of Mayo to the streets of Tel Aviv. It is a reminder that language is not just a tool for communication, it is a vessel for a specific human experience. When we lose a language, we do not just lose words, we lose a way of being.
But as Hebrews shows, we can also bring those ways of being back from the brink if we are willing to do the engineering. If you are interested in the deeper mechanics of how Hebrew was engineered, definitely go back and listen to episode 1037. We dive into the actual linguistic work that was done to modernize the vocabulary. It is a great companion to what we have discussed today.
And if you're curious about why your brain seems to hold onto your first language so much more tightly than any language you learn later, episode 799 on first language attrition is the one for you. It explains the cognitive science behind that permanent ink analogy. We really appreciate Daniel sending this one in. It is one of those topics that seems simple on the surface but has these massive geopolitical and psychological implications.
It has been a great discussion, Korn. I think we have given people a lot to think about regarding the future of their own linguistic heritage. Whether you are in Ireland, Israel, or anywhere else, the choices you make about what language you speak at home matter more than you think. They are the building blocks of the next generation's reality.
They really do. Before we wrap up, I want to say a quick thank you to all of you for listening. We've been doing this for over 1,000 episodes now, and the community that has grown around my weird prompts is just incredible. We love seeing your feedback and hearing how these discussions spark conversations in your own lives.
Yeah, it is really rewarding. And if you have a second, leaving a review on Spotify or your favorite podcast app actually helps a lot. It helps more people find the show and join the conversation. We do not have a huge marketing budget, so we rely on word of mouth from listeners like you.
You can find all our past episodes in a contact form on our website at myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there so you never miss an episode. We have plenty more weird prompts to explore, and we are glad to have you along for the ride.
Until next time, keep asking the weird questions and looking for the deeper stories. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Korn. Thanks for joining us in Jerusalem. We will talk to you in the next one. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.